You're watching 345. I'm Jason Van Loo, and this is Level 3.
With HTML5 and CSS3, you've been coding up those websites functionally. We all know the secrets, now you can know too. So come on down and join Professor Jason Van Loo.
In this level, we're going to look at header and navigation elements, some of the most important elements on your website. First, I'd like to introduce you to our case study site that we're going to be using throughout the rest of the course to sort of practically apply what we've been learning. So this is Border and Radius, a local brew house with great food and even better beer. Sounds like my kind of place. Now we're going to be using this site and breaking down individual elements of the site to apply some of the HTML5 and CSS3 expertise that you now have. As we move through each level, we're going to be focusing on three primary points: design, markup, and style. But before we go any further, let's chat for a brief moment about what makes up a successful navigation and a successful header. So we have 5 points that we want to consider when it comes to designing and developing effective header and navigation sections of our site. The first is know your user. Now you want to know your user no matter what site you're developing. A one-size-fits-all approach to web design just doesn't work, so you want to make sure that you're keeping your user in mind when you're building these elements. The second is keep it clean. Now we want to make sure that our header and navigation elements are free from distraction. So that means that we want our branding to be prominent, and maybe a couple of key call to action points are also appropriate for that section. Third, we have 3 to 4 elements. Now, we all should know what the top priorities of the sites that we're building are. We should ask ourselves the question, what do we want the user to do when they access our site? Now, all of those priorities don't necessarily have to be totally flushed out in your header or your navigation, but maybe you have a couple of key call to action points or key links that you want to call your user's attention to. The header is a perfect place to put that. We also want to simplify our navigation. So we don't want to have 28 different links to all of our pages of our site in our main navigation. I think it's a good practice to keep our main navigation at around 6 to 8 primary links, and then you can decide how you want to drill down the rest of your navigation from there. Finally, we want to be a tour guide. Now it's our job as designers and developers to guide our users to where we want them to go on the site. So it's important for us to think like a user as we're building these websites. Alright, so let's quickly go through some of the design practices and strategy that we use to build the Border and Radius site. So in talking with the client, over a few pints of course, we went through the 5 points we discussed earlier. Let's apply those points to our design. First, know your user. Border and Radius knows that their customers are drawn by the history of the brew house as well as their changing organic menu. We wanted these to be featured prominently since each is a valuable component of the brand. Second, keep it clean. This section is certainly very clean. It matches up with the restaurant's existing branding and keeps unnecessary distractions to a minimum. Third, 3 to 4 elements. We have 2 key elements, history and menu, in this section, in addition to the branding elements, so this works. Fourth, simplify navigation. We have 7 links, which is towards the upper end of our limit, but since we've chosen to use a fairly wide page layout and have kept our overall styling simple, it works. Finally, be tour guides. We've constructed the layout and overall design of the site with the user in mind, helping to guide them to the most important elements on this page and in the rest of the site. Alright, so now let's move on to the markup. So here is our header and our navigation. So previously in HTML4, we might have marked this up to look something like this. We have our div ID header, and then we have 3 anchor points. We have our 2 images, better beer and menu promo, and then we also have our logo. Now if we add our navigation, it would look something like this. We have a div ID navigation with an unordered list with our navigation elements there. So how might we use our new HTML5 skills to refactor this into HTML5? Well, we could move our header elements into a header tag, and we could also move our navigation elements into a nav tag. So all of this is still valid HTML, but we've just organized our markup a little bit better. So in this case, I've chosen to give the primary navigation and the header an ID. Now if you remember in HTML5, we can use HTML5 tags in multiple areas on our page. This is something that you shouldn't do with IDs, so if you have a div ID header, for instance, you really should only use that once. Well, with the HTML5 header tag, we can use that in multiple sections of the page. I know in our site we're going to be using it in multiple sections, so I've chosen in this case to give it an ID to give me more options and variety in styling. Otherwise, our markup looks exactly the same as it did before. So that's our markup for these two sections. Now let's go ahead and move into style. So let's review our elements again, and we'll start with the header. So we have a header with the ID of main, and we have two images, Better Beer and Menu Promo, in addition to our logo. So let's start with styling the two images. We'll start with Better Beer. So here are the basic styles for the Better Beer image. Now what we want to do is we want to create a rollover state for this image. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to use our opacity property in CSS3, and we're going to say that our static image is going to have an opacity value of 0.65. Then when we add our hover state, we're actually going to set our opacity value to 1. So what this does is when we roll over the image, we're actually seeing the full image. When it's in its static state, it's actually a little opaque, and you can kind of see how this renders here. Now this is a neat little way of doing it, because before we would have had to save out two different images. In this case, we can save out just one image and adjust the opacity using CSS. Now let's look at our second image, Menu Promo. This is going to follow the same concept as our Better Beer image. So here are the basic styles for Menu Promo. We're going to go ahead and add an opacity value to the static state of 0.65, and we're also going to add an opacity value of 1 to our hover state. So just like our Better Beer image, we have a static state that is a little opaque, and then when you roll over it, you're going to see the full image. It's a great way of creating rollover states with CSS with really not a lot of time involved. Okay, so let's talk about our logo. Now for our logo, we could have done the same thing as we did for our previous two images and just adjust the opacity values on hover. But instead, let's get a little crazy and actually add a CSS transition to the hover state. First, let's look at our basic styles for our logo. Now we're going to add CSS transitions to our style sheet. So here's what the code would look like. Now notice we have our vendor prefixes first for WebKit, Mozilla, and Opera, and then the basic property following. Now let's spend a little bit of time talking about CSS transitions. CSS transitions create smooth animations using CSS, as opposed to maybe JavaScript, which is what we would have used before. Now CSS transitions have three properties that we want to consider. The first is the transition property. Now the transition property tells us what piece of the object is being affected. So in this case, it's going to be the opacity. Now we could have chosen the background or the color or another property, but we'll stick with the opacity for this transition. The second property is the transition duration. Now this tells us how long the transition lasts. You can play around with different values to get your desired effect, but in this case we're going to go with 0.2 seconds. Finally, our third transition property is the transition timing function, and this basically tells us how we want the transition to work. So in this case, we want to use the ease in out property, which is going to give it a nice intro outro effect. Now there are 5 properties for the transition timing function. We have ease in out, linear, and Bezier curve. Now for the most part, you probably want to stick with ease and linear, as those are the most commonly used. So now that we have our CSS transition in place for this element, we're going to go ahead and add a hover state in which we set the opacity value to 0.70. So let's sort of summarize what we've done in this transition here. First, we've created a transition in which we're going to affect the opacity. We're going to do that for 0.2 seconds, and we're going to use the ease in out function to give kind of an intro outro effect. And what that's going to do is when we hover over the logo, it's going to drop the opacity to 0.70. So let's go to the live site and I'll show you what we've built thus far. So for our Better Beer image and our Menu Promo image, you can see the opacity rollovers we have in place. Pretty neat that we can use just one image and adjust the opacity directly with CSS. And if we take a look at the logo, you can see how it fades in and out smoothly. courtesy of the CSS transition that we just built. Now let's move on to the navigation. So in this navigation, we have a few things that need to be styled. We have a background that we want to style with a box shadow. We have our text, which we want to style with a text shadow and actually add an @font face declaration. And then we're going to add a transition on the rollover effect. So let's start with the @font face declaration. So the first thing we're going to do is add our @font face declaration to the top of our style sheet. Now if you remember, we can hit up the website Font Squirrel, which will generate the CSS that we need to set this @font face property. And in doing that, we'll get code that looks something like this. Now notice we're using Droid Sans Bold for our navigation. Once we have that, we'll go into our CSS and continue styling out the main navigation section. So if you remember in our markup, we had a nav with an ID of primary. So here we have the hash primary elements. Now you'll notice that I've already put the Droid Sans Bold font in my font stack. Remember, we've declared that already in an @font face property at the top of our style sheet. So now we're calling that font in our font stack. Now we're going to add a box shadow to the background of our navigation element. So here's what the code might look like for that. Now notice we have our vendor prefixes first, WebKit box shadow and Mozilla box shadow, in addition to our regular box shadow property. And remember, our values are X offset, Y offset, and then blur, in addition to our color value. And then we've put that above our font stack, which remember includes our Droid Sans Bold font that we declared with an @font face. Now that that's done, let's go ahead and start styling out our text. So here are the basic styles for that. Now notice we've added a text shadow, and just like box shadow, we have our values X offset, Y offset, blur, and color. So in this case, we have a dark text color on a light background. So remember, we're going to do a text shadow that is offset bottom right with a light color because we want to give it that letterpressed effect like it's being stamped into the background. We also want to define a border radius for our hover state because who wants just boring rectangles in the background? Why not round those corners? So in this case, we've added our vendor prefixes first for our border radius property, and we've defined our radius to be 5 pixels. Here's how that might render. Finally, we're going to add a CSS transition to this to really tie everything together. So in this case, we're going to do our vendor prefixes first. Remember to include Opera. And then we have our basic transition property at the bottom. Now remember, in our previous transition example, we just used the property opacity when we're talking about what portion of the object we want to be transitioned. In this case, we want everything to be included in the transition, so we're going to use the transition property all. We're going to set the time function at 0.3, and then we're also going to use our ease in out function just like we did in our last transition property. So let's go ahead and take a look at the live site, and I'll show you what the navigation looks like in real time. So we have our navigation section with a box shadow on our background, and you can see how our Droid Sans Bold text renders properly. Let's check out the rollovers. As you can see, we changed the color of the text. Now you can see the text shadow, and we also have our smooth transition. To me, it's much better than just a simple hover state. It's a small detail, but I really think it adds a lot to this section. Now that we've gone over how to craft effective header and navigation elements, it's time for you to apply what you've learned in this level. Let's start coding.